Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to have Linda Chavez with us for the second half of our show, a woman who's had a long and distinguished career in and out of government. She was the highest-ranking woman in the Reagan White House, staff director of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and the first Latina nominated to the U.S. cabinet by George W. Bush. These days, she works on immigration reform when she's not busy as an author, columnist, and news commentator. Linda, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you.
Linda, one of your ancestors served as the governor of what is now New Mexico, back when the territory was still under Mexican control, but perhaps of more impact on your life. During Prohibition, your grandfather was a bootlegger. I understand he served time in Leavenworth Prison.
Absolutely.
How did that affect your childhood?
Well, it affected my father dramatically. My family came to what is now New Mexico in the early 1600s, and they were part of the original settlers in 1601. And the family was well-to-do, affluent, well-educated. My grandfather went to college, so they were prosperous. But when Prohibition came about, my grandfather decided, he was a businessman, and he decided there was this market for people who wanted to drink booze, and he had an avenue. And in fact, he would import booze up from Mexico and bring it into New Mexico. And one of his frequent stops was the state capital of Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he supplied most of the politicians. But unfortunately, the Volstead Act eventually caught him up. He was arrested, and he spent 11 and a half years in Fort Leavenworth prison in Kansas. And that really sent my family into deep poverty. My father ended up having to drop out of school at the age of about 14 to support his brothers and sisters, and he was never able to complete his education. And so even though he was one of the most brilliant men I ever knew and one of the best read men I ever knew, he was consigned to doing what was essentially manual labor. He was a house painter.
And I understand that you moved around a lot as a child.
We did. We moved around. I lived in boarding houses and rooming houses and apartments, basements, attics, and many different places. We moved eventually from Albuquerque to Denver, where my mother's family was from. My father's name was Chavez, but my mother's maiden name was McKenna. She was a beautiful blue-eyed blonde that fell in love with this tall, dark, and handsome American soldier.
Classic American mixed marriage, I guess.
Well, yes. You know, it's very interesting that you say that because back in that period, we didn't even think about that as such. I mean, if you remember Hollywood from the 1940s, some of the greatest leading men from, Cesar Romero to Anthony Quinn to Ricardo Montalban and others were Hispanics, and they were often paired with blue-eyed blondes, and we didn't think much about that.
That's true. Things have changed. But look, you got yourself educated, and early in your career, you worked very closely with Albert Shanker at the American Federation of Teachers. Tell us about your union experience.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I was at first a lobbyist, and then I was the editor of all the publications at the American Federation of Teachers. I started working there in 1974. And I stayed there until 1983 when I left to work for President Reagan. But Al Shanker was an enormous influence in my life. He was certainly a very aggressive union leader, fought aggressively for higher wages and, control the union control over working conditions. Mm-hmm. But he was also somebody who had a lot of insight into education, and he was a champion of education reform. A lot of people would be surprised to learn that Al Shanker thought that teachers should be held to higher standards. He was in favor of standardized testing of students. He didn't have much truck with such things as bilingual education or affirmative action. Today, if you were talking about him, you might even think he was a conservative. But that is where I got my political start in terms of Washington really getting working in public policy and politics.
And you speak with admiration about him, but you went on after you left to write a book called Betrayal, How Union Bosses Shake Down Their Members and Corrupt American Politics. What was that about?
Well, I did write that book because what I saw happen to the labor movement is you lost a whole generation of leaders like George Meany, who was president of the AFL-CIO, like Al Shanker, and like a handful of others, who really were, they were old-fashioned labor leaders. They worked on bread and butter issues, and they represented the interests of their members. But what ended up happening is, as unions became less and less relevant, particularly in the private sector, you saw a shift away from the kind of union activity you'd seen, from the 30s on, to activity that was really focused on politics. And a lot of labor leaders decided that they could win at the polling place more effectively than they could win at the bargaining table. And so, particularly with the aggressive growth of public sector unions, you had essentially the workers electing their own bosses in the form of mayors and city councils and members of Congress, etc. And they moved away from bargaining for things to being able to put demands and have government be able to fulfill those demands. And I think that's really corrupted both American politics, and I think it's corrupted the union movement.
I don't know if you had a chance to read James Lacey's Taxifornia. We had him on the show a couple of weeks ago, but he details how $500 million of union spending on politics in California essentially bought them the legislature.
Absolutely, and it's done that everywhere. I mean, if you want to look at any major city in America, whether you're talking about Detroit, which is bankrupt, or Chicago, which has one of the worst school systems in the country, to Washington, D.C., where you spend more per capita on students than practically any place in the country, and yet you have largely failing test scores. You've seen huge amounts of money poured into education, but it has not resulted in better education for the kids. And I think that's really unfortunate. And frankly, I think had Shanker lived and had he continued to be in the labor movement, he would have been quite dissatisfied with what's happened, because I think he was, first of all, he was a patriot, he was an American, believed in this country, and I think he would have been not very happy to see what has happened to the American labor movement.
I have to go back and take another look at his life. In the 1990s, you moved on and you served a 4-year term at the UN Human Rights Commission, actually working on a study of systematic rape and sexual slavery, ultimately released under your successor. What kind of impact did that report have?
Well, it had some impact. I wish it had had more. This had to do with the women who were imprisoned and turned into forced prostitutes during World War II by the Japanese. They went into China, they went into Korea, they went into Burma, they went into the Philippines, and they literally kidnapped often very young girls, 10, 11, 12-year-old girls, and then brought them to be what were known as comfort women. And they essentially brought them to service troops. And my goal was to try, first of all, to get Japan to recognize that what it had done was a war crime, that there ought to have been reparations paid to the victims, and that they had to acknowledge their culpability. And that was very difficult. They finally did, after these 4 years and after the report was issued, issue a formal apology. They did give money to the various governments. Some governments, like South Korea, did provide funds and help the women who had been victimized by this. Other countries really did not. And so I'm disappointed that we weren't quite as successful as I would like to have been on that issue.
Well, it's tough for governments to look back on their own transgressions. Now, in 2001, President Bush nominated you for Secretary of Labor. That's probably the first time I heard your name. And you made the news because you were the first Latina to be nominated for cabinet position. And I remember a ferocious search and destroy campaign that cropped up that ultimately led to your withdrawal. Why are key Democratic operatives so alarmed whenever a Hispanic Republican, particularly a woman, rises to prominence?
Well, I think it was a combination of things. It wasn't just that I was an Hispanic woman and a conservative. It was also that I was being nominated to be Secretary of Labor, and I knew where all the bodies were buried, quite literally, in the labor union movement. And so I think there was some concern that I would have been a very effective Secretary of Labor. Certainly sympathetic to working men and women, sympathetic to union members in their goals of, seeking a better life for themselves, but also understanding that particularly when you come to public sector unions, that, you can't basically have unions bankrupting cities and states, which is what's happened.
Not
so I think there was a real effort to find what they could, and they ultimately were able to find that I had taken into my home a young woman who had come to the United States illegally. She was basically, when I took her into my home, she was in a women's shelter. She had come here and found refuge. She thought she was coming for a job that turned out not to exist. She ended up living on the streets for a while, and she was nearly also forced into a life of prostitution. And so I was asked by a friend if I would give her a place to live for a while she got back on her feet, and I did. And I did not hire her. She didn't work in my house. She, put dishes in the dishwasher when she needed to, but I cooked most of her meals. So it was...
right, it wasn't an employer relationship.
No, it was not an employer relationship. But nonetheless, I knew she was in the country illegally. I did not go out and report her. I didn't ask INS to come pick her up. And, today you would think, well, it would be conservative.
Makes you a hero. I would think that would make you a hero. But it was liberals. They did not like it. And, of course, they engineered, what was a very difficult time. And, of course, the allegation was that I had been another Zoe Barrett, that I had been that I'd hired. That's how they framed the story.
So that was, but, she and I both felt very badly about it, but at a certain point, President Bush, I think, was being harmed by the controversy, and so I ended up just withdrawing my name.
Well, it's quite a double standard. We recently had a Treasury Secretary who was an admitted tax cheat, and that didn't seem to bother anybody.
Yeah, no, it is very interesting, because that was the whole issue was, well, you should have paid taxes. Well, you can't pay taxes on somebody when what you're essentially doing is giving them the bed. And, and she came and went on her own. I got her English lessons. I helped her find somebody to teach her to drive. And by the way, I ultimately did provide her with some money for her to go back to Guatemala, where she came from. And she later immigrated to the United States, was able to come here and become a legal resident and a U.S. citizen.
Well, I'd like to get onto that immigration issue. I know that's an important part of your life right now. But one more stop along the way after that episode. You went on to found the Center for Equal Opportunity, focusing on affirmative action, immigration, and bilingual education. Tell us about that.
Well, I actually started the Center for Equal Opportunity back in 1995. And I was head of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights under President Reagan. I went from working for Al Shanker to working for Ronald Reagan, and that was my entree into the Reagan administration. I had always been skeptical of the idea that we should have double standards, one that applied to whites and Asians and a different standard for blacks and Hispanics. To me, that's racist. To me, assuming that because the color of someone's skin or where their ancestors came from, that you assume something fundamental about them and that they're not going to be able to succeed, for example, in school. I don't like that. I think as they say, I think it's a fundamentally racist notion. So I founded the Center for Equal Opportunity, which is exactly that. It proposes that we should have equal opportunity, but that we can't guarantee equal results.
I mean, in one of your post columns, you criticized Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor for attributing her success not to intelligence and hard work, but affirmative action. Why so?
Yeah, I am very puzzled by Justice Sotomayor, because she's a perfect example of somebody who had hardship. She came from a working-class family with an alcoholic father, as I did. She had to struggle very hard. When she got into college, she discovered that she really was, had not learned the things she needed to learn. She didn't write very well. Her vocabulary and grammar, I think, were not as she hoped. And so she took it upon herself to educate herself. I mean, she basically tutored herself, started reading the classics. I think she, spent time studying grammar books. Very much self-made. Yeah, and that's how she made it. But, instead she thinks that it was because Princeton had an affirmative action program, and that's what allowed her to succeed. That I think, again, is not the right message we ought to be sending kids. Well, what is it about our culture that makes affirmative action advocates proud to cite Justice Sotomayor as an example of that policy success, and not President Barack Obama, who clearly benefited from many such advantages? Oh, yeah. It's very interesting. Affirmative action is so deeply entrenched now. We have it throughout corporate America. We have it throughout the education system. We have it throughout government programs, contracting and other things. And, initially it was supposed to be a way to make up for past discrimination. But even if we assume that that is still its purpose, we're talking about having policies in place 50 years after the Civil Rights Act was passed. And you're talking about not even the children, but the grandchildren of people who suffered real discrimination now benefiting from programs based on that legacy. And at some point, even Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said, there has to be a time limit on this. We can't just continue to give preference and make excuses for kids not working hard enough or doing as well on tests, or the school systems failing to give the students the skills necessary for them to be able to succeed.
It'll be interesting to see how that continues to unroll in the months and years ahead. Your current passion is immigration. You wrote a column claiming that killing immigration reform is a tragedy for the GOP, and I understand you've formed a new organization. Can you tell us about it?
Yes, I have formed a group called the Becoming American Institute, and I chose that name carefully because I think that this nation is a nation of immigrants. We have benefited dramatically over the course of our history by taking in people from all over the world who come here wanting to succeed and wanting a better life for themselves and their children. But we do expect that once you're here, that you learn English, that you play by the rules, and that you succeed under the same rules as everybody else. And so I think that, some of the emphasis throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, even in 90s, was on such things as multiculturalism, where everybody was expected to sort of hold on to their ancestral past.
Right. We were a mixed salad, not a melting pot.
Right. And I think that's not a great model. I think we're much better off being a nation where we speak one language and where we are one people and we have one culture. It doesn't mean that, at home, you speak whatever language you want, or, have your own cultural groups, or newspapers or theater. We had Yiddish radio, Yiddish newspapers. We had German language schools. We still have those kinds of programs around the country. But when we come into the public squares, we ought to all be one nation.
And yet your posture towards immigration is a welcoming one.
Yes, because I don't think today's Latino immigrants are any different than the Italians, Greeks, Poles, Russians, and others who came before them. And in fact, it's not just my not thinking that. I've done a lot of research. I've written a book about it called Out of the Barrio. I've been writing on this subject for 30 years and done a lot of research, both original and secondary research. And Hispanics are integrating and assimilating and learning English at every bit the same fast rate as other groups before them did. And so I think we need to be welcoming. I think we need to understand that as a nation, we need labor, and we need people at both the high end and the low end of the skills spectrum. We've got lots of people in the middle. We need those STEM workers, science, technology, engineering, math workers, but we also need people to work in our fields and pick our crops
and put up drywall
in our buildings.
In my experience, they come here to work. When I bought my first home, there was a knock on the door, and there was a Hispanic immigrant with a rake who offered to rake my leaves. And within 5 years, he had a whole crew out there with trucks and leaf blowers, and he drove up in a Corvette. It was quite a progression.
That story is repeated literally tens of thousands of times. And in fact, I am always surprised when people think that immigrants take American jobs. They say, oh, they're stealing our jobs, they're taking our jobs. No, they actually create jobs. First of all, they do jobs that, frankly, it's not necessarily, that we want Americans who've been educated in our school system through 12 years of high school to be working on chicken processing lines. We hope there are more opportunities available for them to do something that takes the skills that we've given them. So the fact that you've got somebody coming in and taking those lower-level jobs, they then spend money in the community. Their children go on to get better educations, and many of them do exactly what your friend did, which was to become entrepreneurs.
Small businessmen.
And then they become bosses. They're hiring people. They're not taking jobs. They're creating jobs.
What advice would you give the Republican Party, who seems to have a very strong and vocal nativist element that is doing everything they can to drive Hispanics out of the party and shut down immigration?
Well, first of all, the demographics are going against us. And if, the Republican Party is going to be the party of married whites and not very many others, it's going to be a party that's going to be a minority party. So we have to do better among Hispanics. And the fact is we can do better. We have done better. Going back to Richard M. Nixon, we had Hispanics voting in large numbers. A third of Hispanics voted for Richard M. Nixon the second time around. Almost half of Hispanics voted both for George W. Bush and for Ronald Reagan for president. So we need to do a better job reaching out. And in order to do that, we have to look like we're not trying to deport Grandma or Cousin Jose. We've got to figure out a way to fix our legal immigration system. The way to end illegal immigration is to come up with a legal immigration program that admits enough people that people do not have to try to sneak in because there are no visas available, which is what we've got right now.
Well, we've had guest worker programs, Bracero programs in the past. What have we learned from them?
Well, I'll tell you what we learned from the Bracero program, which started after World War II. We had 1 million immigrants coming illegally into the United States during the late 40s, early 50s. And that was at a time when our population is half what it is today. That would be the equivalent of 2 million people crossing the border illegally today. And what we found is that when we put in a guest worker program, we were able to take that 1 million people a year and drop it down to less than 100,000. So we got rid of literally 90% of illegal immigration just simply by giving people an avenue and a way to come here legally.
And to be protected by the law while they're here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which keeps it from becoming victims.
Yep.
Linda, what role does education play in assimilating immigrants?
Education has always been the kind of melting pot where people became Americans. I mean, in the early 20th century, when we had many more immigrants coming really than are coming now, we had certainly as big an influx and proportionately slightly bigger influx of people coming in the early 20th century. And what happened is they went into public schools and they learned English and they learned American history and American civics.
I'm talking about my parents here who grew up speaking a foreign language at home. It's exactly what they did.
That's exactly right. And, we forget that. Everybody says, well, why aren't the Hispanics learning English? Well, none of the first generation learned English all that well in the past unless they came here with a lot of education. They struggled, and particularly the women struggled. It was not uncommon for the Italians and Germans and Jewish, housewives to not ever learn English well enough to be able to go out into the marketplace. But their kids learned English and they learned it in public school. And that's what we need today. We need to focus on helping newcomers learn English as efficiently and quickly as possible. But we also need to prepare kids to do something better than the manual labor that their parents came here to do. I mean, it's great that we have these immigrants coming to work in construction or work in poultry processing or work, cleaning buildings or houses. But we hope that their kids will be doing something a little better, and it's important for them to get educated to do it. And frankly, Bill, one of the really fascinating things is that in the past, we have had a struggle getting Hispanics to continue their education past high school. That has turned around, and we now have more Hispanic high school graduates going on to college than we do non-Hispanic whites. That's a dramatic turnaround in the last 20 years.
I didn't realize